Today, we have our great speaker, Dr. Jasser here. I'd like to thank the provost for helping with this event. It has been a work in progress since about May of this year, so we're happy to see that it's finally come full circle and that we have this presenter here today. So Dr. Jasser is the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He is the host of Reform This, a podcast that discusses the faults between the West and Islamic communities. He's written the book A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. He is also a former U.S. Navy lieutenant commander, physician, husband, and father. A frequent television commentator on Blaze TV, Fox News Channel, CNN, and MSNBC, he is also the co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement. We are all very excited to have Dr. Jasser here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jasser.
Thank you, Cammie. It's great to be with all of you, and it's an honor to be in Utah, and hopefully you won't hold it against us wimpy Arizonans who bring our thick Alaskan wear to wear here. And I have to tell you that the students are just fantastic. The paradigm of having a student-run center, I want to thank the Michael Leavitt Center on Politics and Public Policy, and I think the paradigm that you have of having students run a center, set the agenda, run the conversations, bring in speakers with opinions like myself in, I think is, you know, I have to tell you, as we talked today about the Arab awakening and the changes, those changes were led by youth. They were led by the young in society who wanted a legacy of change. So thank you, and thank you to the leadership here, our Provost Cook and everybody for giving them the room to do that. And one of the themes that we tell our youth in the Muslim community and our reform groups is governments, teachers, universities need to basically stay out of the way. And what do I mean by stay out of the way? Which is you can't grow, you can't reform, you can't modernize unless you allow youth to think on their own, to be critical thinkers, to be individuals. And the ability to stay out of the way, I think, is one of the primary things that is uniquely American, is uniquely Western, and we're trying to bring into the Muslim community. You know, when you look, as I thought about what I wanted to talk to you about today, there's so many things to think about when you're talking about Islam and democracy, and sort of this evolution, as I listed here, of science, reason, reform, and revolution. But there are two basic obstacles that we're fighting. And obviously you all think about terrorism, I'll talk about that in a second, but the main thing is military dictatorships in the Middle East, and the opposite side of that same evil coin, if you will, is political Islam or Islamism. And at our American Islamic Forum for Democracy, that has been our focus. You know, when you talk about terrorism, how do you define terrorism? Anyone want to define terrorism for me? What do you think that is? Yes?
Using fear and force to influence political beliefs.
Excellent. So it is asynchronous warfare. It is the targeting of non-combatants, and its intention is to change the policy of the country, of the community, of being attacked, basically to invoke fear so that we change our policy as Americans, as Westerners, whatever country is being attacked. And they want us to withdraw, they want us to isolate so that they can invoke their own policies. Now, what are those policies? Often coming from groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, it's hard to define what those are, but I think it's important to understand what that is. Terrorism is a tactic. I mean, the entire mantra after 9/11 was a war on terror. Imagine World War II being a war on blitzkrieg. That was the tactic, right? Is it a new normal? I pray and hope that never, ever will fear of terrorism, as we saw just this week in OSU, that all of a sudden it just gets one day of attention on the media and then it goes away. You know, this is sort of the bane of my existence in trying to reform and treat the root cause, is that we have an attack and then we come together as one country and pray and hope and pray that this never happens again, and we talk about thoughts and prayers being with families, and then we go back to our partisan divide in America and go back to our politics and center of gravity, which is partisan politics rather than things that unite us. And unfortunately, it allows us, it prevents us from having a strategy in terrorism. But I do believe that terrorism, that symptom, is the tip of the iceberg. It's a sign and root of a deeper problem. You know, I think before I get into what I want to talk to you about, it's always, you know, policy can be policy, and you can sit and read textbooks and textbooks of what Islam is and what it's not, what our policy should have been, and have a lot of these pundits and university, and no offense to professors, but university professors sort of pontificate about nuances of policy. That's all very helpful, but at the end of the day, it's about relationships. It's about communities and who we are as individuals. And briefly, who I am. My parents fled Syria in the mid-60s. They were politically persecuted by the Ba'ath regime. Ba'athism is a national socialist fascist movement in Syria, similar to the Ba'athism of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. My grandfather and father had been educated in London and had understood what Western democracy was and had sort of dreamed of having a Western-type system in Syria. My grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, was not only a businessman in Aleppo, but had a newspaper that he wrote and led, which also was very active with the People's Party, as Bishab it was called in Aleppo. And in the late 40s and early 50s, there was a movement of democracy, of parliamentary systems that lasted about 4 years, from 48 to 52 in Syria. Then from 1952 to 63, there were 20 different coups in Syria, with coup after coup happening that basically were changes in military leadership, and they realized in Syria that the corrupt military would continue to solidify power until finally the Ba'ath got in power in 63. And we can talk about that, but you can't separate Syria's history from where ISIS is today. And you can't separate who I am as an individual from my family's narrative and their legacy as they left and saw in America an ability to be Muslim and practice our faith more Islamically than any Muslim country on the planet. I grew up in Wisconsin. I'm a cheesehead, proudly. Packer fan, come Cardinals fan now. Growing up, having my kids grow up in Arizona, having been in Arizona now for almost 20 years. But at the end of the day, I'm a physician. I put the bread on the table by taking care of patients as a primary care doctor. I decided to serve the Navy for 11 years on a Navy scholarship. But that's an important part of who I am, because as I learned about my faith in that little small town in Neenah, Wisconsin, my parents built the first mosque in northeastern Wisconsin in 1979. And by the way, it wasn't without controversy. It was in 1979, right during the Iranian hostage crisis, in which Iran had been on the headlines for day after day with them abusing our hostages. And there was a little bit of a controversy. They didn't want our mosque built because they were concerned about Muslims. But that was a small fraction of a few hundred activists. The majority of Wisconsinites and our neighbors, our Christian and Jewish and other neighbors, wanted us to build that mosque, and I learned about the interfaith hegemony of America and our unity, our motto of out of many one. And that sort of, I talk about that in my book as being part of who I am, learning that the theological message that I learned, which was very sanitized in Neenah, because I didn't know about political Islam, I didn't know about the Muslim Brotherhood, Wahhabism, or all these other isms that are part of Islam. I simply learned my scripture from my family and learned about my faith as being something between me and God. Our mosque was a small little $50,000 building. There was an attempt by Saudis to help us build, and our families rejected that money and said, you should take care of your own poor in your own country, don't send that money here to influence what we teach. But that's not the narrative of many Muslim communities in America. Unfortunately, foreign money, what I call petro-Islam, has colored what Islam is in America. But I joined the Navy because my narrative was about believing that no matter how little freedom I have, I will always be close to God. So I don't need my government to have a close relationship with God. And I learned that from Elijah Izbegovic. Elijah Izbegovic was the president of Bosnia-Herzegovina. But before that, he was under house arrest under Tito, dictator of Yugoslavia, for decades. He was under house arrest for 15 years. And he wrote in his book, Islam Between East and West, he said that he was never